I'm Angela Saini, I'm a science journalist. I write books really about how science hits society, so the politics and the people behind scientific research. My two most recent books are Inferior, How Science Got Women Wrong, and Superior, The Return of Race Science.
Okay, so when did Superior come out?
So Superior came out in May 2019. So it's only been a few months as of now when I'm talking, and it's been kind of a roller coaster because it's been exciting to see the response to it, and I've had such a wonderful response. I've also had quite a backlash from racist, neo-Nazi and white supremacist types, so it's been interesting and not completely unexpected because I do call out certain people in the book, and I do name some far-right groups and far-right publications that are involved in modern day scientific racism. So I fully expected that kind of response, but we live in challenging times, so that's the nature of the work that I do.
I think you getting an angry response speaks for the work in a way, because when you hit the nail on the head, that's, and people get angry, it's like you're, touching a nerve. Yeah. And so what kind of negative response did you get? Was it like online, or was it very personal? Did you get letters home, or was it emails?
Well, I've had all kinds of strange hate mail related. Sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's just plain racist. Other times it's kind of attacking the central premise of the book, which is that race is not a biological construct but a social one, which is quite widely accepted in the scientific community. But there are still those out there in the world who don't accept that that's what genetics says and what it has always said. And would like to revive some aspects of race science in order to preserve the fiction of, for example, white supremacy, or that there are certain reasons why the world economically or historically looks the way it does, who would like to frame inequality, racial inequality, as a natural product rather than a product of history and politics and society, which it is. So I understand that. We live in, very difficult times right now. Mm-hmm. Politics is so divisive, and with the kind of push for equal rights and social justice around the world, you also get a hard backlash. We see the rise of ethnic nationalism, we see the rise of the extremist far right, and there are ideologies within these networks of people on the far right that really stretch all the way back into 19th century scientific racism. So these are very kind of discredited pseudoscientific theories that they have, but people cling to them because they support their political position.
How much of the negative backlash do you think is based on your book and the research, and or you as a person, your background and your gender?
It's very difficult to say, because I do think when you have a public profile as a woman, you do gain far more abuse than if you're a man. If you're a woman of colour, then obviously you gain more again. But it's difficult to say, because I think these kind of people attack everyone who attacks them. So I have seen, white male scientists also attacked quite widely for just stating the scientific facts, just right, because they disagree with them. So I don't think I'm an exception in that case, but I think it does hurt them to know that it's not just their ideas that are being attacked, but particularly that they're being attacked by someone who looks like me.
So in your book, Superior, which I love very much, you talk about the subtitle, or the tagline is The Return of Race Science, and you talk about the scientific background to race, or what we think race is. Yeah. But you also talk about race relations in the UK, and to some extent abroad as well. Yeah. So how would you describe and explain race relations in the UK to an outsider?
Well, I think every country has its own particular history and set of circumstances around race, and this is why racial categories differ depending on the country that you're in, and different categories matter depending on the country that you're in. So in the UK, for example, historically, this is quite a classist society. So class, for example, in the history of eugenics, class was a major, major factor at the beginning of the 20th century in terms of determining who are desirable citizens and who are undesirable citizens in figuring out eugenic policies. Race sometimes creeps into that because of immigrant groups. Immigrant groups tend to be poorer, and so they also get lumped in with these things, but sometimes also in and of itself race becomes an issue in terms of ideas about Western cultural and racial superiority, which you see throughout the history of slavery and colonialism. So Britain, of course, has played such a key role in the history of slavery and colonialism. And so Britain's relationship with race is a strange one, because on the one hand, the colonial project was framed, at least in the eyes of some people, the colonizers, as a kind of benevolent thing that a paternal thing, that we are going out and we are bringing civilization to countries that don't have it, which again in itself is a racist idea, that other countries can't possibly be civilized by themselves, or that don't have civilization already. I am a product of that, because the British were in India, and my extended family, my grandparents and their parents, were products of empire. In fact, my great-grandfather and my grandfather fought for the British under empire. They were in the Indian Army. And one of the reasons I'm here is because my dad learned English because the British were there, and he wanted to move to Britain because it was seen as a brilliant, desirable place to come, and that's why I live here. So in some ways I'm the product of that history, not just a colonial history, but in some ways a racist history, and I am British. So, these are complicated, layered things, and this is something I try to explore in the book. What does nationality and identity mean? Especially when you sit in different camps, as often the children of immigrants do, is that we feel that we belong to one place, but we're made to feel that we belong to another. And we have to square that kind of cultural sense of identity and local sense of identity with also biological ideas of identity based on how we look.
To what extent do you think white British people are aware of that history that you just talked about, and the presence of non-white people as a result, to an extent, here? How aware do you think they are?
It's difficult. I'm sure some people are more aware than others, and there's a wonderful tradition within the social sciences in this country of studying race. Critical race theory obviously is a field that really engages with these questions. But everyday Britons do not learn about the history of empire the way it really was. So in that sense, and also there's, especially I noticed around the time of the Brexit referendum, sometimes there was this rhetoric around making Britain great, looking back to the past, looking back to Victorian Britain, for instance, when the empire still existed, as though this was a moment of this was a moment to be proud of Britain, forgetting that, the empire is not something to be proud of. It was actually incredibly damaging and brutal, and that brutality is something you don't learn about when you're raised here. I didn't learn about it when I was at school. So I think it's something we need to educate ourselves about. It is possible to do that. There are some wonderful books out there right now that do a good job of educating people about British Empire.
Right. What are your thoughts on colour-blindness as a solution to, or as a proposed solution to racial inequality? Do you think it's even possible to not see colour?
It might be possible for an individual to claim that they don't see colour, but I don't think it's healthy for a society that in which racism, structural racism and institutional racism exist, to be colourblind, because then you don't acknowledge the racism and discrimination that people are experiencing. You kind of ignore it. So in my book, as I argue, as scientists argue really through the journalism that I've done, is that race is a social construct, that actually our ideas about race, the categories that we use, have very little basis in genetics and biology. So the categories, while they might feel real and tangible socially, don't map onto the genetics in the same way. So in as much as it doesn't exist very much in biology or in nature, that doesn't mean they don't exist socially or politically. Of course they exist socially and politically. And actually it's a political power that now wields itself in our everyday lives and affects how we live, viscerally sometimes. So the experience of racism and discrimination in some places, depending on who you are, can actually affect your health, your mind, your mental health in lots of different ways. It can have an impact on your body. And a colourblind attitude to race would ignore that, and that's not a good thing, because you don't eliminate racism by not acknowledging that it exists. And to acknowledge that it exists, you have to recognise that these social categories are being used in a certain way.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. People don't see me nodding vigorously. What would you say to people who are very adamant about themselves not seeing colour?
Well, I think I don't understand it. I haven't seen it myself, actually. I've never really met someone who really emphatically believes that they don't see colour. And I have to ask myself then, how is that possible when we live in a society that is so deeply concerned about these things that even on the census form you're expected to categorise yourself and to be able to tick a box. So given that on an almost daily basis, or a regular basis at least, we're expected to notice these things, how can you go about living your life deliberately not noticing them? I think it's almost impossible. And also I'd be cautious of that position for the reasons I gave.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's interesting, those forms, when you have to categorize yourselves. I didn't experience that in Europe until I came here. So the first time I saw that, I was like, excuse me, what is this? I was shocked. So I guess me asking about what you would say to people who pretend or are adamant about being colorblind comes from a personal experience on the continent, on the European continent, because I have personally encountered that quite a few times, and people were they felt very strongly about that. So and I want to educate people, but I don't always have the time or the capacity, and sometimes people don't understand, so it's very difficult. But what you said, that just by ignoring it doesn't make it non-existent.
I think in a utopian dream post-racial society where race really doesn't matter, where racism doesn't exist and discrimination doesn't exist, then perhaps we can, in a society in which we recognise individual difference and we don't recognise group difference, because we know that group difference is far outweighed by individual difference, then perhaps in that kind of society you could live that kind of colour, take that kind of colourblind attitude. But that's not the society that we live in. That's not the world that we live in. So I think it's problematic. I can understand, I suppose, people's desire to move beyond race by taking that position, but I think it's less helpful than they imagine.
What about free speech? Because as long as there is freedom of speech, there will always be those who will use it as a justification for racially motivated hate speech. What are your thoughts on this dilemma? Do you think it's possible to negotiate a balance that protects both the rights of one to freedom of expression and the rights of another to not be discriminated against?
Yes. Well, in some ways in the UK we already have that, because we have legislation against hate speech. You're not allowed to target minorities, you're not allowed to spout hatred against other people in everyday life. Online though, the rules are completely different, and in some ways the rules don't really exist, because you can write whatever you want, and under anonymity you can get away with anything. And I think that's a problem, is that freedom of speech comes with responsibility, and part of that responsibility is not to infringe upon the human rights or safety of other people. And if you cross that line, then of course there is a public need to make sure that people's safety and human rights are protected. The fact that we don't have those rules operating online is a real problem, because so much of our lives now are online, and these things can have real world consequences, and people can feel really deeply threatened by what people say, and people are just getting away with it. And in some ways the internet has become the crucible for the kind of political unrest we see around the world, because it allowed that line to be crossed for so many people. And not only that, people with very extremist positions and opinions have been able to find each other, reinforce each other, operate within these kind of echo chambers. And these kind of groups operating online, like Generation Identity, for instance, that inspired the Christchurch shooting. We know the Christchurch shooter was online, operating within these online groups, and then he went on to do what he did. And we know that there are other people who are similarly inspired by the groups and the hate-filled rhetoric that they read online. So I think freedom of speech is fine, and I am, all in favour of freedom of speech. But when it becomes a way to beat people with, to attack people, then obviously it's not okay. It doesn't take precedence over the right to life. How can it? That's just impossible. It can't. So
what are your thoughts on recent incidents, for example, where universities allow maybe, let's say, problematic speakers to, have a lecture or an event on their premises, and then students, demonstrate against that because that person may be inciting violence, even though we don't know exactly what he or she will be saying. And then the university, I'm using university now because that's my life right now as a PhD student, they say, we can't really not let the person come because there's still freedom of speech and everybody has a right to their opinion. What is your stance on that?
Well, there are layers here. One is that everyone has a right to protest, and that is also an expression of freedom of speech, so people should be allowed to protest. The second thing is, if that person is coming in speaking, why are they coming in speaking, and why have they been given that platform? Not every single person on the planet has a platform to speak at a university. Certain people are chosen and other people aren't. And one would hope that the people who are chosen because they have certain credentials. Not necessarily that everyone agrees with their opinion, but at least they have certain credentials, that they do good scholarship, that they're recognised within their field as being reliable and trustworthy. And if they meet those conditions, which frankly everyone in academia has to meet, we all have to meet them. Within journalism, we're expected to meet those conditions. And I would have thought that's a minimum for being given a platform to speak within a university. If they don't meet those conditions, then you have to ask yourself, why are they being given this platform? So I don't think it's right to just say anybody can come and speak at a university and you just have to sit there and listen to them, because that is not the way academia has worked or will ever work. Universities are places for people to discuss ideas, and one would hope that the best ideas, and by that I mean well evidenced, rigorous, that meet academic standards, are the ones that are given space to be debated. Ideas that have already been discredited, that have very poor scholarship behind them, that are driven by extremist political ideology rather than fact, or rather than rigorous scholarship. We have to ask ourselves, then, why is that person being given a platform? Is it just to create debate? Is it because there is a vested political agenda? And that's where I think the line is more murky. And that's why sometimes people protest.